That's brilliant. Thank you. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Netflix Series 2 preview of the GM Movie Local Pilot Engagement Lead, which we are calling The Engagement is for Real. Now, in the old days, you could imagine sitting in a cinema with a bowl of popcorn and hearing the roar of the lion. I think it's probably fair to say that we are now more accustomed to being in a living room addicted to Netflix. When we came up with the idea of the local pilot as a Netflix, I remember thinking, if I was to look for it, where would I find the pilot? Which category would it be under? And I asked a question on Twitter, and there was a lot of response from Hayley, who suggested that we might find it under adventure. So if we think back to the adventure that we've had in season 1, we know that at the moment the ratings are high and we are trending on Netflix, which we can roughly translate as having an influencing, really meaningful conversation at both a locality level, a regional level, and at a national level. So this is a little bit of a recap of what we have learned in season 1 and where are we going and what are we going to do in season 2. So the biggest learning to me from season 1 is that we have completely internalized the principles, and it's absolutely fine and fair to say that it probably took us the whole season to do that. So we have learned to move at the speed of trust and not at the speed of KPIs or at the speed of outcomes. And I think the biggest gem we have learned in season 1 is we have learned how not to do things. So we have learned how not to engage with communities, with surveys, or with tokenistic consultations, so that we know not to alienate or to patronize the communities that we live in and we serve. We have learned how not to be prescriptive. So we've learned how not to stifle great organic ideas. So we have learned how to apply those investment principles in practice, and we are still learning processes around governance and funding and investment, which we are moving forward. I think perhaps most importantly, we have learned how to listen deeply to what communities are asking us that they want and they want to see in their places. And in that sense, we have certainly been on a journey with regards to language and the importance of language. And to me, if there was a meta-narrative that will inform all of the seasons and the box set that we will come up at the end of this journey, is exactly that. So we are learning to use and apply a different language when we speak to people. Equally, the engagement has also been to the system. So we are connecting into all sorts of other places, both locally through the pilot and within the GM landscape, if you like, through GM Moving more broadly. Of course, like every season deserves, have been plot twists. I think it's fair to say this one nobody was expecting, and it is possibly the longest cliffhanger ever, particularly for those of us in Greater Manchester who feel like they've been on a series of lockdowns which have been harsher than the rest of the nation. But probably fair to say, as a season 2 opener, it isn't all doom and gloom. The narrative around Build Back Better is now a little bit more mighty, but however you want to phrase it, there is a sense of not wanting to go back to the old normal. And so the plot points that we're going to see in season 2 are the very same plot points that you gave to me when we had our conversations in November and December of last year. So there's a sense in which the plot points are completely yours and you completely own them. And so what I heard from you was that in season 2, we want to reconnect with communities. We want to strengthen and amplify system-wide engagement. We want to continue to build relationships. We need some clarity in governance, investment, and the overall messaging. So again, it kind of goes back to the language. And we need to be better equipped to call out inequalities by name and take informed action to tackle them. So there's a sense in which, having done the theory bit, having done the internalizing bit, season 2 to me becomes more action-packed. So That's why you find us under Adventure in Netflix. And so who are the protagonists? I think it would be fair to say that the protagonists are you. So the people who have already been involved in the journey, in the local pilot, in the steering groups, in the conversation with colleagues and partners across the system. Yes, to a degree, but perhaps more accurate to say that the protagonists are all of us having conversations in a place. So if we go back to looking at GM Moving as a social movement, as opposed to a program or a series of interventions, what we can see is that, in fact, we are all GM Moving. And we will have allies on the journey. These are already existing ones. I'm sure that we will bring more on board as the journey progresses. So obviously, Combined Authority and Health and Social Care Partnership. There are links with the active travel and active neighbourhood work currently led by Transport for Greater Manchester. There are VCSC partners in 10GM, GMCVO, and then there is, of course, the nationwide conversation that Sport England is having with its refresh. It might be an exercise that you are considering or have done. There is something around the matrix that we can use in terms of interest in the project and influence of power, and how to best have conversations with people in those spaces. I have put a link at the end of the presentation if you want to find out more about this matrix. Watch out for potential antagonists. So what are the blockages? What could get in the way? The first one I've identified is a negative mindsets in the Horizon model. Again, there is a link at the end of the presentation that will explain this with more clarity and in more depth. So the idea being that we are currently navigating three models. There's the first Horizon 1, which is the current system. Horizon 3 is the vision of where we want to be. And Horizon 2, if you like, it's the messy in between of how we get there. So there is a risk of going back to Horizon 1 or wanting to stay in Horizon 1, or those organizations and people in a position of power wanting to not move away from Horizon 1 that I think we need to be mindful of. But equally, there is something around having the vision for Horizon 3 and learning from what's best and what can be kept from Horizon 1. The second blockage or potential antagonist that I can see is that having had really rich and meaningful conversations with communities, particularly as a result of the pandemic, and having built a different relationship with formal and informal groups that have risen as a result of it, we go back to viewing communities as a little bit of an us and them. So there's a picture there of somebody taking a photo of an animal in a zoo. So I would not want to see us going back to that vision of communities being something over there, away and alien from us, that we somehow only observe, or at worst, antagonize and exploit. Some characters may be dropped. This will make no sense to you unless you have been watching Game of Thrones, so I apologize for that. And in terms of dropped characters, there are two things I think to be mindful of. The first one is that characters may drop without us having any control over it. So a classic example of that is we have local elections coming up. We know that we have strong allies within the Combined Authority and Andy Burnham's team, which have supported the work, but we can't predict the outcome of a local election. So it may well be that some key characters are dropped and we need to then restart a different relationship with new characters. The second one is what happens when we ourselves are the killers, if you like. So perhaps a bit dramatic, but if you think of it in terms of looking at your steering groups, I know that there have been some refreshments of steering groups in some of the localities. This is also something that other localities might want to consider in this particular season. So who do you want to drop? Who do you want to bring to the table? Production values of season 2 in terms of the engagement enabler, I have shamefully pinched with pride from a TED talk around leadership as orchestra conductors. Again, there is a link at the end of the presentation. It's a very, very funny 20 minutes. I thoroughly recommend you have a look at it when you get the time. And the way that I formulated it is that the engagement enabler is going to become a happy medium between the director on the left and the director on the right. To give you some context, the director on the left is Herbert von Karajan. He used to be the director of the Berliner Philharmoniker, amongst others, and he was an absolute visionary in terms of how he interpreted music. The way that he worked is it made sense to him and it made sense in his head and he got it. But if you look at him, he's directing the orchestra with his eyes shut. So while he was very, very good at getting it and understanding the value of it, there wasn't that movement out to involve the rest of the orchestra in how that piece should flow. So orchestra members would often look at each other for inspiration because they knew they wouldn't get it from the director. Contrast that with Riccardo Muti on the right. The wrist is there for a good reason. So Riccardo Muti is the opposite way of how to lead an orchestra. So he completely had a vision of what the piece should look and feel like, in this case, the engagement. And he completely instructed the orchestra to operate under his own rules, bar the fist. So there wasn't any room for interpretation. There wasn't any room for deviation. So think of that as here is the engagement manual, and you will do it in this way because I tell you this is the only way it will work. Both come with pros and cons, but both are quite extremes. So the way that I'm thinking of moving it forward in season 2 is to be more like these two guys. Now, the guy on the left is a composer called Klaus Kleiber, and the guy on the right, I'm assuming needs no introduction, but is of course Lenny Bernstein. And what they were really good at is to find that happy medium between internalizing the piece, understanding what it is that was needed and valued and necessary, and equally to have the eyes open, to have the arms out embracing, to support the orchestra in being themselves. So Klaus Kleiber called it the doing without doing. And Bernstein used to say, if you love something, learn to give it away. But the eyes are open and the arms are out, which means that the support is there, and the support is likely to be different from the violinist and the trombonist. The support is likely to be different in Bolton than it is, I don't know, in Stockport or Tameside, but the support will be there. So how we're going to do it, get ready for a little bit of a spoiler alert, is that we used to operate in season 1 with an idea that there is community engagement, that there is engagement with the system. We introduced the system leadership work, which in itself was system leadership and community leadership. In season 2, what we're going to be seeing is an alignment of all of these strands. And if you think about it, effective community engagement should by definition lead to community leadership. So the idea is you have the sustainability there, you are ready to let people perform their own piece, if you like, with the support that's necessary. So what we are working towards in season 2 is an alignment of the engagement enabler with the system and community leadership enabler, and to create a series of resources that will be available to localities to use as they see fit. Again, if we go back to the conductor, this isn't going to be a prescriptive manual. This is going to be a series of suggestions, storytelling, sharing of best practice and examples of what's worked. Finally, there is an elephant in the room that I did want to acknowledge because I'm super conscious of the fact that I've not mentioned it or referenced it, bar one slide, and that is inequalities. It is a priority for Sport England, it is a priority for GM Moving. I think it's fair to say it's a priority in a variety of landscapes. And there is something to be done around to how we communicate with communities, with marginalized communities, with communities of interest. It is an ongoing conversation. There certainly isn't a manual for this. It is the start of conversations that we are going to have in terms of how does the inequalities piece of GM Moving align with the broader inequalities conversation that's happening both in the VCSE sector and in the sport and physical activity sector. So I didn't want to not point at the elephant. I think we are in the process of learning how to eat it bit by bit. So that is the end of my presentation. As I mentioned, there is some suggested further reading. I cannot recommend the Tech Talk enough. It really is a funny piece of 20 minutes of your life that you will enjoy. If you have any questions for me, ready to answer them.